President Trump's shifting position on Syria. Here's what he said about it.
I like to think of myself as a very flexible person. I don't have to have one specific way, and if the world changes, I go the same way. I don't change. Well, I do change. And I will tell you that attack on children yesterday had a big impact on me.
So the question is, how big of an impact did it have? We have a great guest to talk about it, Christopher Ruddy. He's the CEO and president of Newsmax, a conservative website. He is also a longtime friend and confidant of President Trump. Chris, one could say the situation in Syria has been devastating for quite some time. But yesterday, President Trump had an emotional moment, so many of us did, when he saw that young children suffocating to death. Do you believe it had such an impression that we're really going to see a policy shift here?
I'm not sure, but I think the president is a very empathetic guy. I know sometimes we see him on TV and he seems pretty rough and tough, but I think he has a lot of empathy, and I think he's going to act. I would not want to be Bashar Assad at this moment. You know, I think Obama made a terrible mistake, and I advocated that the president had the ability to use the force, and he should have done it without Congress. So that is President Obama, and it was a big mistake. I think President Trump now thinks that's a mistake, that they should have used it, and I think there'll be some strike. I don't think it's going to be a total war, but I think what we heard yesterday were very serious words from the president, and he's very resolute when he comes down to make a conclusion like that.
He's also had very serious words to say about China in the past. In 2013, he called China our enemy. And now today, he needs to talk North Korea. He needs to talk trade and possibly get on the same side. How exactly is he going to do that?
Well, I think in the lexicon of Donald Trump, enemy is not such a bad word. You know, he's called the press an enemy of the people. So I'm a member of the press, but I think sometimes the president makes those statements and he's creating a negotiating position. I think he wants to deal. He's also said, you can find quotes, where he said he wants to deal with China. He and I spoke by phone just over a week ago, and he was talking to me about the Chinese summit, and he described it as the big one. And the big meaning, I think it's the biggest summit he's had so far. And you're dealing with China, which is the second largest economy in the world, much more important than Russia, which has the GDP of Mexico. So China is very important to the strategic interests and the economic interests of the United States. And I think the president recognizes that, and that's why he's invited President Xi to his home in Florida.
Trade is something that President Trump from the beginning understands, or, you know, it's a focus for him. But North Korea, how much does he want to dig into this? President Obama had said when he left office, this is one of the biggest threats that we need to focus on. Do you believe President Trump agrees?
So the history of American dealing with North Korea, starting with General MacArthur's argument that if we don't deal with these guys, we're never going to get rid of them. And I think he was proven very prophetic back in the 50s, actually. But American politicians largely have tried to bypass it, ignore it, not deal with it. My experience with Donald Trump is that he's the type of guy that runs to a fire, not runs away. He runs to a fight. And he sees North Korea growing. We're now at a precipice because not only do they have nuclear warheads, which we've turned a blind eye over many administrations to, but they now are very close to getting ballistic missile capability that can deliver those nuclear weapons, perhaps to Hawaii and soon California. And I think the experts are pretty much in agreement on that. So it's a grave danger, and I think the president recognizes that. And I think he will act, and what he's basically saying is China has a very strong influence, if not the strongest influence, over the North Koreans, and we should force them or pressure them to act. So I think it's actually a pretty clever policy right now.
Tekka, let's go to a different kind of conflict inside the White House. There's reports that Steve Bannon threatened to quit. If he did, if he does, is that a gift to President Trump? Is that what Trump wants? Stephen Bannon got him here, but there is so much criticism about his fringe views. It's where the conspiracy theories come from. Is that what Trump wants? Does he want Bannon to leave?
I have not heard that. The president's always spoken very highly to me of Steve Bannon. I've seen them down here several times down in Florida. The president, I think, is a loyal guy. Steve was very loyal to him when very few people supported him. And I think when you look at all of these, I've known Steve for a number of years now. I first met him about 15 years ago when he was in private business. I have never seen any racist or anti-Semitic behavior on his part. I think you could go through anybody's website and find people making comments that are inappropriate or marginal.
Hold on.
But I don't think that reflects
Do you believe
Steve.
that on Newsmax, if you put Newsmax up against Breitbart, do you believe the level of offensive language and racism would be the same?
Well, I haven't compared both of them, but I do think Newsmax tends to be much more careful than things that go on Breitbart. That is true. And we are not Breitbart. But I do believe that Steve personally, so you can listen to, look, if I tuned into the Howard Stern show today, I would hear a lot of things. Do I think Howard Stern's a racist? No.
Okay, but you know what, Chris?
I would hear some pretty wild things on that show.
I don't think that's fair, because your word is your bond. And if you are a news organization, if you're a public person, what you put out there in the world matters.
Well, if you actually see what Steve himself has put out, look, I'm not here to defend Steve Bannon. We have disagreements on lots of things, like I'm not for a protective tariff. I am much more open, I think, than Steve is on immigration. I think America needs immigrants. We need more legal immigrants. I think we need a very humane policy dealing with illegals. I think America's future depends on immigration. So I would have some policy differences with Steve, but on a personal level, I don't think he's a bad guy. I think that the president, obviously, you know, my experience with Donald Trump is he's much more of a centrist than Steve has been in the past. He much more wants to occupy the middle ground, the common ground with people. He's a compromise deal maker type. And I think we're going to see more and more of that coming through as the months and years go on in the Trump administration.
Well, we'll see. All right, Chris, thanks so much for joining me this morning. I appreciate it.